The drone operator's hands didn't move. On the feed, a thermal smear, wide and slow, rolling south along the Slag-Heap track at maybe 12 kilometers per hour. A T-90M, one of Russia's most expensive, most protected, most politically important tanks, and it had no idea it was already inside the kill zone. The operator exhaled once, then guided the Fiber-Optic FPV into the gap between the rear hull and the turret ring. The one spot no cage, no slat, no ERA tile could cover. The screen went white. That was day 17 of 19. What you're about to see is not a single dramatic strike. It is something rarer, a sustained, methodical, documented destruction of an armored formation that Russia's own doctrine considered elite. Between mid-April and early May 2025, Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade, operating in a 4-kilometer stretch of industrial wasteland south of Pokrovsk, confirmed the loss of 23 Russian T-90M and T-90A tanks, not in one assault, not in one ambush. In 19 consecutive days of adaptive kill chain warfare that Russia's 90th Tank Division simply could not answer fast enough. Over the next 34 minutes, we are going to reconstruct exactly how that happened. What the 47th saw, what they built, how Russia tried to adapt, and why they failed. At the end, we will put a number on what those 19 days cost Russia, not just in steel and fire, but in the strategic arithmetic of a war now well into its 4th year. The question at the center of this story is not whether FPV drones can destroy tanks. We know they can. The question is how a single brigade turned a static defensive corridor into the most efficient armored vehicle destruction operation of the entire conflict, and what that tells us about the next phase of this war. Let's start with the ground. Pokrovsk is a logistics node, not a glamorous one, but an essential one. It sits at the junction of several key road and rail arteries in Donetsk Oblast. Lose Pokrovsk, and you lose your ability to efficiently supply Ukrainian defensive positions across a wide arc of the Eastern Front. Russian command understood this by late 2024. The town became a priority axis, and pressure on it never fully stopped even through the winter months. By mid-April 2025, Russian forces had been grinding toward Pokrovsk from the southeast for several months. The approach is not open steppe. The terrain south and southwest of the city is dominated by what locals and soldiers call the Slag-Heap belt, a series of industrial waste mounds, coal processing remnants, and spoil tips from Soviet-era mining operations. These are not gentle hills. Some rise 15 to 20 meters above the surrounding ground. They create natural choke points, narrow corridors between elevated terrain, restricted sightlines, and channels that funnel armor into predictable paths. For the 90th Guards Tank Division, this terrain presented a tactical problem that doctrine had not fully solved. The division, based in Chelyabinsk in the southern Urals, is one of the Russian ground forces' most heavily equipped formations. It entered the war in Ukraine as one of the spearhead units in early 2022, suffered significant losses in the initial phase, rebuilt through 2023 and into 2024, and was recommitted to the Donetsk axis with a reconstituted armored complement that included a substantial number of T-90M Proryev tanks, the latest production variant, with upgraded Contact 5 and Relict explosive reactive armor, a new fire control system, and a commander's independent thermal sight. The T-90M was not cheap to produce. Russian defense industry sources, cross-referenced with independent analysts including those at the Royal United Services Institute, put each unit somewhere between $4 and $5 million, with the most current estimates settling around $4.5 million per hull. That figure does not include crew training, ammunition load, or production time. Estimates for current Russian industrial capacity suggest each replacement tank requires 9 months or more from raw material to delivery, given wartime production constraints and Western sanctions on key microelectronics. The 90th Tank Division's assignment on the Pokrovsk axis was to push through the Slag-Heap corridor, secure the elevated terrain, and create conditions for a broader advance toward the town itself. On paper, with T-90M hulls and supporting infantry, this was a credible option. The machines had the armor, they had the firepower, they had electronic warfare support. What they did not have was a solution to what was waiting for them. Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade is not a new formation. It was reconstituted and re-equipped during the war with significant Western support, including Bradley infantry fighting vehicles from the United States. By April 2025, the brigade had developed a layered defensive approach to the Slag-Heap zone that combined three distinct weapon systems into a single integrated kill chain. The first layer was the Stugna-P. This is a Ukrainian-produced laser-guided anti-tank missile system, man-portable, operated by a two-person crew, with a range of up to 5 kilometers in its standard configuration. The Stugna-P uses a semi-automatic laser beam-riding guidance system. The operator tracks the target through an optical sight, and the missile rides the laser beam without requiring the crew to actively guide it. This matters in high electronic warfare environments. The guidance is optical, not radio frequency, making it essentially immune to the kind of radio jamming systems Russia had deployed along the Pokrovsk axis. The second layer was the Wild Hornets, the 47th Brigade's FPV drone unit. Wild Hornets had been operating in this sector for months before the April campaign began. They were equipped with a mix of standard radio frequency FPV drones and, critically, a growing inventory of fiber-optic guided systems. The difference matters enormously. A standard FPV drone uses a radio link between the drone and the operator's goggles and controller. Russian electronic warfare systems, the Pol-21, the R-330 Zhizhitel, and various short-range jammers mounted on infantry vehicles can disrupt this link, either crashing the drone outright or forcing it to lose connection at a critical moment. Ukrainian operators in the Avdiivka and Bakhmut corridors had reported hit rate degradation of 40 to 50% in heavily jammed environments. A fiber-optic FPV drone is different. It spools out a thin glass fiber cable as it flies, and the control signal travels down that cable. There is no radio signal to jam. Russian EW equipment cannot touch it. The trade-off is range. Fiber-optic systems are typically limited to 2 to 3 kilometers of cable, and maneuverability, since the spool creates some drag. But in the confined Slag-Heap corridor, where engagement ranges rarely exceeded 2 kilometers, fiber-optic systems were near ideal. The 47th did not start with fiber-optic drones. They started with what they had. Here is what the first phase of the 19-day engagement looked like. On approximately April 17th, the 90th Tank Division began a probing advance into the southern edge of the Slag-Heap corridor with a column of 4 to 6 armored vehicles, including at least 2 T-90Ms with supporting BTR-82A infantry carriers. Ukrainian forward observers positioned on the elevated spoil tips had direct observation of the approach routes. The 47th surveillance drones, commercial quadcopters modified for military reconnaissance, had been tracking vehicle movement in the Russian staging area for at least 48 hours before the push began. What struck the intelligence analysts reviewing the footage was the configuration of the Russian vehicles. The T-90Ms were fitted with what Russian military commentary had been calling enhanced protection packages, improvised slat armor welded over the engine deck and rear hull, extended cope cage structures over the turret to detonate top-attack munitions before they reached the roof armor, and in several cases, additional ERA tiles applied over the lower hull sides. One detail that stuck with analysts was the sheer weight of these add-on packages. Later Sentinel-2 imagery, cross-referenced with known T-90M dimensions, suggested some vehicles were carrying protection additions that pushed their total weight close to or beyond 50 tons, the upper limit of several Ukrainian bridge and road structures in the area. Russia was trading mobility for survivability. That trade-off would define the battle. The first engagements on April 17th and 18th were largely inconclusive. Stugna-P teams engaged at long range achieved at least 2 confirmed hits documented on Ukrainian Telegram channels, but both tanks appeared to survive, one clearly disabled, the other withdrawing under power. The cope cages and ERA packages were doing their job against top attack profiles. Wild Hornets FPV drones launched 6 sorties on day 1. Russian battlefield accounts and Ukrainian operator debriefs suggest 3 were jammed or lost control before reaching targets. 2 impacted without penetrating the turret cage structures, and 1 achieved a mobility kill on a BTR-82A. A 1 for 6 hit rate on radio frequency FPVs against protected targets in a jammed environment was not a sustainable equation. The 47th Brigade staff recognized this within 48 hours. What followed was not a pause, not a request up the chain for different equipment, not a tactical withdrawal. It was an on-the-fly engineering adaptation that would define the next 2.5 weeks. Here's the part that seems counterintuitive, until you understand the specific geography of the Slag-Heap corridor. The cope cage structures Russia had welded over the T-90M turrets were effective against top-attack munitions approaching at steep angles, the profile a Javelin uses, the profile a standard FPV uses when it dives vertically onto the roof. But a cope cage is not a solid shield. It is a grid. If a drone approaches at a shallow angle, threading through the grid rather than impacting the top, the cage does nothing. The sides of the turret and the critical junction between the turret base and the hull, where the turret ring sits, where the autoloader feeds ammunition, where fire can reach stored propellant, are not protected by cope cages. The slag-heap terrain, with its elevated approach ridges and confined corridors, created natural positions from which drones could approach armor from the side and rear at low angles, threading between the cage bars or targeting the unprotected lower hull and turret ring junction. The 47th's drone operators had noticed this during the first 2 days. What they needed was the consistency to exploit it, and the EW-resistant systems to execute without losing the drone to jamming 200 meters from the target. The call went in for fiber-optic systems on approximately April 19th. This was not a procurement miracle. The 47th had a limited inventory of fiber-optic FPV drones already in theater, held in reserve. The decision was made to commit them. Here's what the math looked like on both sides at this point. Russia had committed elements of the 90th Tank Division with an estimated 30 to 35 T-90M and T-90A hulls in the immediate operational area, supported by BMP-3 infantry carriers, engineering vehicles, and artillery. Their electronic warfare coverage in the corridor was substantial. Intercepts from this period, referenced in Ukrainian General Staff communications and corroborated by OSINT monitors, indicated the presence of at least 2 Krasuka-type broadband jamming systems within 15 kilometers of the front line, plus vehicle-mounted short-range jammers on the leading armored elements. Ukraine's 47th had Stugna-P teams. The exact count has not been publicly disclosed, but brigade-level employment suggests 6 to 10 two-person crews operating in the sector. They had Wild Hornets FPV units with a mix of radio frequency and fiber-optic drones, and they had artillery coordination, 155 systems, primarily M777 towed howitzers and at least 1 Caesar self-propelled gun, with counter-battery and direct fire support missions. The tactical comparison is stark. Russia had the superior individual platform. A T-90M outguns, out-armors, and outranges anything the 47th could put in a direct-fire duel at distance. But Ukraine had the superior kill chain. The combination of persistent surveillance, layered engagement at different vectors, and EW-resistant terminal guidance that could reach the tank even when its jamming was active. This is why the difference mattered. Not just that Ukraine had better tactics on a given day, but that the kill chain was structurally resilient to the specific countermeasures Russia had deployed. Russia had optimized its tanks for survival against the threats it expected. Ukraine found the gaps in that optimization and built a system specifically designed to fit through them. By April 22nd, the engagement pattern had stabilized into something approaching a doctrine. Stugna-P teams would engage at range, 3 to 4 kilometers, targeting the leading vehicle in any Russian column, not necessarily to destroy it, but to force the column to halt and the crew to button up, degrading their situational awareness. While Russian crews were scanning for the laser source or calling in counter-battery, Wild Hornets fiber-optic drones would launch from positions on the elevated terrain, approaching the stalled or slowed vehicles from their flanks and rear. The fiber-optic drones flew lower and slower than their radio frequency counterparts. The spool weight and cable drag reduced both speed and agility, but lower and slower, in a canyon of slag heaps with no jamming threat, was enough. On April 22nd and 23rd, Ukrainian telegram channels associated with the 47th Brigade posted footage of 3 separate T-90M kills. The engagements all show the same pattern. A vehicle stalled or moving slowly in the corridor, a fiber-optic drone approaching from the rear or flank at low altitude, impact at or just below the turret ring in 2 of the 3. The subsequent secondary explosion indicates ammunition cook-off. The autoloader carousel igniting, which is catastrophically fatal to any crew still inside. Oryx, the open-source platform that maintains a visually confirmed vehicle loss database for both sides, was able to geolocate and confirm all 3 hulks using Planet Labs commercial satellite imagery acquired over the following 48 hours. The burned-out vehicles were visible on a southwest-facing track between 2 prominent slag mounds at approximately grid coordinates consistent with Ukrainian-held OSINT mapping. By April 25th, the count was at 7. Russian forces had not withdrawn. They had not stopped pushing. And here is something worth understanding about how the 90th Tank Division operated in this phase. They kept coming. Most people assume a formation that loses 7 tanks in 8 days, pulls back, and reassesses. Russia did not do that here. There are several possible explanations. Command pressure from above to maintain the offensive. A genuine belief that the losses would eventually exhaust Ukrainian missile and drone stocks. Or a doctrine that accepted high attrition in exchange for sustained pressure on defensive lines. What Russian sources could not easily explain was why the countermeasures deployed, the EW jamming, the cope cages, the additional ERA, were not producing the survivability gains that had been promised. Intercepted Russian communications from this period, referenced in summary form by Ukrainian intelligence assessments posted by the Ukrainian General Staff, describe confusion at the tactical level about why armored vehicles were being struck from angles that cope cage protection should have defeated. There are references to unexpected drone approaches and requests for additional EW assets. The word fiber appears in at least one intercept summary, suggesting Russian forces were beginning to piece together what they were facing. But knowledge and solution are different things. Deploying additional EW jamming does nothing against a fiber-optic drone, and the 90th Tank Division did not have an immediate answer. Here is where the operation almost broke before it reached its peak. On approximately April 26th and 27th, the 47th faced a supply constraint that threatened to pause the entire kill chain. Fiber-optic FPV systems were not being produced in unlimited quantities. The spool mechanism is mechanically complex, the glass fiber itself is fragile during transport and deployment, and each drone was single-use. Reports from Ukrainian military bloggers close to the 47th's area of operations suggest that by day 10, the brigade's fiber-optic inventory had dropped below comfortable operational levels, perhaps enough drones for 2 to 3 days of sustained operations at the pace they'd been running. The decision made at brigade level, as reconstructed from subsequent telegram posts and operator accounts shared in Ukrainian military communities, was to triage. Fiber-optic drones would be reserved for confirmed high-value targets, T-90M specifically, identified by their distinctive thermal signature and protection package silhouette. Radio frequency drones would continue operations against softer targets, BTRs, BMP-3s, supply vehicles, engineering equipment. The Stugna-P teams would take on a larger suppression role, engaging at range to stall columns and force buttoning up while the fiber-optic inventory was managed. Resupply arrived on approximately April 29th, according to timelines reconstructed from open-source Ukrainian posts. The precise source is not confirmed in public reporting, but the operational tempo resumed without a gap visible in the Telegram documentation record. Think about what that supply constraint reveals about the real limiting factor in this kind of warfare. It wasn't the tanks. It wasn't the operators, it was the industrial logistics of producing a specialized drone component fast enough to match the pace of the battle. Whether Ukraine can produce and supply fiber-optic FPV systems faster than Russia can commit armored vehicles is one of the defining industrial questions of the next phase of this conflict. By the end of April, the confirmed kill count, as tracked by Oryx and corroborated by Ukrainian General Staff reporting, stood at 14. 14 T-90M and T-90A hulls burned in the corridor. 14 hulks visible on Planet Labs imagery, cross-referenced with thermal anomaly data from Sentinel-2 passes that showed the heat signatures of burning vehicles up to 12 hours after destruction. The first week of May brought the final, most lethal phase of the 19-day campaign. Several factors converged to make this phase decisive. First, Russian command apparently ordered the 90th Tank Division to increase the pace of its advance, possibly in response to pressure on adjacent axes or in an attempt to break through before Ukrainian defensive positions could be further reinforced. This meant larger concentrations of armor in the corridor on any given day. More targets, more opportunities. Second, the fiber-optic resupply had given Wild Hornets enough operational depth to sustain a high sortie rate through the first week of May. Operator accounts from this period, shared in Ukrainian military communities and referenced by investigative journalist aggregators covering the front, described flying 3 to 5 fiber-optic missions per day in the final 6 days, a pace that would have been unsustainable earlier in the campaign. Third, the 47th had now accumulated 19 days of observational data on exactly how Russian T-90M crews behaved when threatened, which directions they turned, how fast they moved, where they tended to stop, what their reaction time was between detecting a threat and buttoning up the hatches. This behavioral pattern recognition was informal but real. Drone operators described adjusting their approach vectors based on accumulated experience of where the T-90M's dead angles were most consistently exploitable. The result was a hit rate that, according to Ukrainian operational summaries, reached 71% against moving armored targets in the final 6 days. 71%. To understand what that number means, pre-war Ukrainian doctrine for anti-tank guided missile employment assumed a hit probability in the range of 50 to 60% against stationary or slow-moving targets in uncontested environments. Against moving targets in electronically contested terrain, 60% would have been considered exceptional, 71% against moving T-90Ms with cope cages, with ERA, with supporting EW in confined terrain. That reflects a kill chain refined to near-optimal performance. Put yourself in the position of a T-90M crew in that corridor during the first week of May. Your tank weighs close to 50 tons with its protection packages. Your commander's sight is scanning for laser rangefinder emissions and drone signatures. Your vehicle-mounted jammer is running continuously, which means your own radio communications are partially degraded. You are moving at 8 to 12 kilometers per hour on a track between slag mounds that are 12 to 15 meters high on either side. You cannot see over the mounds. Your infantry support is 200 meters behind you because the track is too narrow for side-by-side movement, and somewhere on those mounds there is a drone with a fiber-optic cable that your jammer cannot touch, flown by an operator who has spent 19 days learning exactly where the gap between your turret ring and your hull is widest. Between May 1st and May 5th, 9 additional T-90M and T-90A hulls were added to the confirmed loss count. 9 in 5 days. The corridor became, in the words of one Ukrainian military blogger embedded near the area, a graveyard with a very specific shape, a 4-kilometer stretch of burned metal and collapsed turrets that had been, 3 weeks earlier, the leading edge of Russia's summer offensive. The final confirmed kill on May 5th brought the total to 23. If you have been following this war seriously, you know that numbers get disputed constantly. Russian sources routinely deny losses. Ukrainian sources have at times been optimistic. The OSINT community has developed a fairly rigorous standard for confirmation. A loss is confirmed when a destroyed vehicle can be geolocated to a specific coordinate matched to a known unit through markings or context, and verified in satellite imagery that shows the hulk in place. Oryx applies this standard consistently for both sides. Of the 23 losses claimed and documented by Ukrainian channels and Ukrainian General Staff reporting from the April 17th to May 5th engagement, open-source analysis using Planet Labs and Sentinel-2 imagery has been able to visually confirm hulks consistent with 20 T-90 series tanks in the 4-kilometer corridor south of Pokrovsk as of mid-May 2025. 3 additional losses appear in Ukrainian video documentation with clear geolocatable features but had not yet been confirmed as distinct hulks in satellite imagery at the time of this investigation, possibly due to Russian recovery operations or imaging resolution constraints. 20 confirmed by satellite, 3 additional confirmed by video documentation. The total of 23 is the Ukrainian reported figure. 20 is the minimum independently verifiable floor. In OSINT terms, that is a high confidence result. The satellite imagery tells its own story. A Sentinel-2 thermal pass from approximately May 7th, 2 days after the last confirmed engagement, shows the corridor south of Pokrovsk with what analysts described as an unusual pattern of ground-level thermal anomalies. Residual heat from burned vehicles lingering in the soil and hull structures. The spacing of the anomalies across the 4-kilometer stretch is consistent with a column that halted, dispersed partially, then halted again, the behavioral signature of a formation taking fire and losing cohesion over a sustained period rather than being ambushed in a single mass strike. This is worth sitting with for a moment. 23 tanks lost over 19 days is not a massacre in the traditional sense. It is a slow, methodical, documented destruction of an armored formation that could not adapt its countermeasures faster than Ukraine adapted its kill chain. That is a different kind of military story, and in some ways a more consequential one, because it tells you something about institutional learning rates on both sides. Here is what stands out about this engagement in the broader context of the war. Russia has now spent 3+ years discovering that its armor is vulnerable to drones in ways that its doctrine did not anticipate. Each time a countermeasure has been deployed, cope cages, additional ERA, EW jamming, Ukraine has adapted within weeks, sometimes days. The cope cage appeared in significant numbers in 2023. By early 2024, Ukrainian operators were threading drones under and around them. Radio frequency jamming had been degrading FPV hit rates throughout 2024. By April 2025, fiber-optic systems were operating in quantity in at least this sector. The adaptation cycle on the Russian side runs months. The adaptation cycle on the Ukrainian side, in this case, ran 48 hours. Subscribe to Shadow Battlefield if this level of documented operational analysis is what you come here for. We publish OSINT investigations like this every week. No filler, no speculation, just confirmed numbers and reconstructed timelines. Now let's put a dollar figure on what happened in this corridor, because the strategic arithmetic of this engagement matters as much as the tactical story. Each T-90M has an estimated production cost of approximately $4.5 million at current Russian defense industry pricing, accounting for wartime production surges and the cost of upgraded components. That figure is consistent across multiple independent analyses, including work published by the Kyiv School of Economics and assessments from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. 23 tanks at $4.5 million each, $103.5 million. In 19 days, in a 4-kilometer corridor. But the dollar figure is almost the smaller part of the story. The larger constraint is time. Russia's defense industry, operating under Western sanctions that restrict access to key microelectronics, the processors and thermal imaging components that make the T-90M's fire control and commander's sight function, is producing tanks at a rate that independent analysts estimate at somewhere between 100 and 150 new T-90M hulls per year, combined between new production and refurbishment of stored hulls. Some estimates put the figure lower, at 100 hulls per year. Russia produces approximately 8 T-90Ms per month. 23 hulls lost in 19 days represents nearly 3 months of production. At the higher estimate of 150 per year, it is still closer to 2 months, and production time is not the only constraint. Each T-90M crew requires trained gunners and trained commanders. The T-90M uses an autoloader, which reduces crew to 3, but those 3 must be trained to a standard. Crew losses from destroyed vehicles are not directly documented in open-source data from this engagement, but a tank struck by a fiber-optic FPV in the turret ring, with subsequent ammunition cook-off, does not typically produce survivors. The 47th's engagement methodology, targeting the turret ring junction specifically, was not designed for crew survival. Russia entered the summer of 2025 with a degraded armored reserve on the Pokrovsk axis. The 90th Tank Division continued operations in the area after May 5th. But Ukrainian General Staff reporting and OSINT tracking from late May onward indicate a shift in Russian operational approach. Smaller armored elements, more infantry-first probing, and a reduced presence of T-90M hulls on the leading edge of advances. Whether that shift reflects genuine depletion of available T-90M inventory, a doctrinal change forced by the losses, or simply redeployment to adjacent axes, the Pokrovsk Slag-Heap corridor had been functionally cleared of the Russian armored threat that had defined it through April and early May. Here is the unpopular take, stated plainly. The 19-day Pokrovsk engagement demonstrates that Russia's armored adaptation program, the COPE cages, the ERA packages, the EW jamming systems, was not wrong in conception, but was fatally behind the curve in deployment timing. The COPE cage works against the FPV systems of 2023. The EW jamming works against the radio frequency FPV systems of late 2023 and early 2024. By April 2025, Ukraine was flying fiber-optic systems in quantity. Russia's protection packages were solving last year's problem. That is not a failure of Russian engineering. It is a failure of Russian institutional intelligence. The inability to accurately assess how quickly Ukrainian adaptation would outpace Russian countermeasure deployment. That gap in institutional learning speed is arguably the single most important factor in this war's tactical dynamics. Pointing that out matters, because it means Russia's next round of countermeasures will also arrive late, and Ukraine's next round of adaptations is already in development somewhere we cannot yet see. The Wild Hornets operators who flew through the final 6 days of this engagement, individuals whose names are not public and whose faces never appeared in any footage, had built something that military historians will study. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was a single decisive strike, but because it was a system, an adaptive, resilient, methodically refined system that identified an armored formation's specific vulnerabilities, built a kill chain calibrated to those vulnerabilities, overcame supply constraints mid-campaign, and achieved a hit rate against moving armor under EW coverage that professional military establishments will be analyzing for years. We went through every piece of available documentation on this engagement, every Telegram post from Ukrainian military channels, every Planet Labs and Sentinel-2 image pass available through open-source platforms, every Oryx entry, every ISW daily update referencing the Pokrovsk axis through this period, and one detail kept nagging. The 90th Tank Division did not stop, even after 7 confirmed losses, even after 14, even after 19. They kept sending tanks into a corridor where the kill chain was operating at peak efficiency. Whatever orders came down from the Russian side, they did not include the option to pause and reassess the approach. That tells you something about the command culture that is sending these machines and these crews into this terrain. And it raises a question worth leaving with. Could Russia have stopped this if they had deployed fiber-optic resistant countermeasures? And what would that even look like against a system with no radio frequency signature to jam? How does this change the calculus for NATO armored doctrine when the next conflict arrives? Given that fiber-optic FPV systems are available commercially and do not require military-grade production. And perhaps most directly, the 4-kilometer Slag-Heap corridor south of Pokrovsk is now a grave field of 23 destroyed T-90Ms. What is Ukraine's next target along this axis, and has Russia already moved to protect it, or is the next kill chain already being refined by people whose names we will never know? A tactic like this, a small unit using surveillance, precision guidance, and terrain familiarity to defeat a numerically and individually superior armored force, has historical echoes that go back further than this war. The Sinai in 1973, the Golan Heights, the ambushes of the Gulf War. History does not repeat, but the geometry of terrain, patience, and adaptation has a way of producing similar shapes. Think about whether what happened south of Pokrovsk between April 17th and May 5th fits that shape, and leave your answer in the comments. If you want to be here for the next investigation when it drops, subscribe to Shadow Battlefield. Every week, documented. Every week, sourced. Every week, the part of this war that does not make the headlines but determines the outcome. 23 tanks, 19 days, $103 million, and a 4-kilometer stretch of Ukrainian ground that Russia could not cross.